Hello there, AP World History students, and thank you for joining into part 4 of chapter 19. We are going to be looking at Japan in transition. I think this is such an interesting photograph. I mean, the guy's like smoking a cigarette, right? And he's got no shoes on or just sandals, wearing a bamboo or some kind of a grass cape. Um, and it really reflects, I think, how Japan was during the early 19th century and then contrasts that with where they ended the 19th century. It is quite amazing. So since 1603, remember the Tokugawa shogunate had taken over. This was the Bakufu government. It was supposed to be just temporary. That's what Bakufu means. However, their goal was to keep peace among the daimyo and the samurai. They wanted no foreign trade except with the Dutch. Dutch learning was something that that's how they learned about what was going on in the rest of the world. They did trade with the Dutch in Nagasaki. In the early 1800s, they experienced an agricultural crisis and turmoil including low agricultural productivity, crop failures, harsh taxes, especially from the Tokugawa shogunate, who had every other attendance year in Edo, or what we now call Tokyo, for the daimyo to keep control of them. And then we have famine, and we have really, really desperate people when they're in famine. I think I've talked about this before, how they will resort to eating things like tree bark and leaves and things like that, that humans are not really prepared, or bodies are not designed to get any nutritive value from those things. The samurai class and the daimyo, they ended up becoming indebted to the merchant class. They really, other than trying to, get taxes from people, the merchant class, even though they were considered kind of low on the social status ranking of Japanese society, were the ones that were making money. And so we have a situation where the farmers are migrating to urban areas, and because agriculture is a problem, they're not getting work in the rural areas, and they go to these urban areas and they're still finding destitution and hunger. So things are not going well in Japan in the early 1800s. So the Tokugawa, they have some ideas about how they can maybe institute some reform in Japan. And if you look at these dates, 1841 to 1843 is very similar to the time period that we're talking about in the Ottoman Empire. They canceled debts owed by samurai and daimyo to merchants. Now, one can presume that the merchants didn't take this very well. They abolished the merchant guilds. Okay, so now we no longer have the guilds controlling what products are going to be made and what the prices are going to be. They say, peasants, move back to the farms. We need to work on agriculture. The reform was ineffective. There was strong opposition. And as with other reforms that we've seen in other empires, it just didn't work. Now, we also have from the outside foreign pressure. So in the early 1800s, the Tokugawa continued to refuse any European and US request to use their ports except for the Dutch. And they wanted to use Japan. Japan was actually quite a natural stopping point for ships to refuel as they headed towards the primary ports in the Philippines or down in Southeast Asia. They called the ships, well, so first of all, we have U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry. That's a picture of him right there. He demanded the shogun to open Japan to diplomatic and commercial relations. How did he do this? Through gunboat diplomacy. What is gunboat diplomacy? Well, it looks like something like the British attack on the Grand Canal in China. The ships that Matthew Perry brought towards Japan were called black ships because they had coal-powered engines in them along with sails. So they used a combination of energy to get to where they were going. And basically, Matthew Perry showed up at the port or showed up at a port on the coast of Japan and said, "Let us land or else." And so we call that gunboat diplomacy. This forced onto Japan unequal treaties. We saw unequal treaties in China as well. We'll see in the long run, Japan had a better plan for sort of negating some of these unequal treaties. The Americans were given extraterritorial rights, and this led to a domestic crisis. I've already described what extraterritorial rights are, so I'm not going to do that again. Shogun's in trouble. The shogun and the Tokugawa, they're not doing well. And so what can be done? Before we move on to what is done, I do want to show you these pictures because I think they're interesting. This is a photo of Matthew Perry. This is a Japanese drawing of Matthew Perry. And I just think it's kind of interesting the way that they take his facial features and they sort of caricaturize them. Certainly they didn't, portray him as a particularly fun or nice looking guy. And he probably wasn't, to be honest. All right, this is a picture of Emperor Meiji or Michido. So what happened is there's a humiliating situation triggered by civil war between many disgruntled groups. So you have the Bakufu, you've got the daimyo, you've got the samurai, the shogun, and everyone's kind of unhappy with everything that's going on, including the unequal treaties. And a change has to happen. So in 1868, the shogun is forced to resign, and the 15-year-old boy, Muchido, who had imperial roots, remember the emperor was just a puppet head, like a bobblehead, right? But Meiji was not going to be that way. Actually, Emperor Meiji was incredibly open-minded about what Japan needed to do to catch up with the rest of the world. So his goal, the goal of the Imperial Japan, was to transform Japan into a world power through intense westernization and industrialization. This included getting rid of the samurai, getting rid of the daimyo, completely changing the order of Japan. This time period will be called the Meiji Restoration, and it was a very, very dramatic change in Japan. So what did it include? They sent Japanese people, almost like undercover agents, to Europe and to the U.S. To look at their factories, to look at their military, and they also hired foreigners to facilitate economic and military development. Now, the Japanese Emperor Meiji was very familiar with the success of the U.S. in fighting the Indian Wars and was interested in following that model in order to get rid of the samurai class. In the 1870s, Emperor Meiji centralized political power, abolished the social order, the samurai were abolished, the daimyo privileges were suspended. Of course, there's huge opposition. The samurai culture had been so central to Japanese life. But what he actually did was forced samurai, if they came into town, many of them, as you may know from movies, wore a top knot on their head. And they had some of the sharpest and best swords in the world, in the history of the world. But if they came into the city dressed with a top knot, someone would literally come and chop off the top knot of the samurai. They didn't want that symbol anymore. A constitutional monarchy was adopted. So Emperor Meiji did have a constitution, and then he progressed on a period of intense industrialization. So within just a couple of decades, transportation, infrastructure, including electrification and communication, commerce, financial institutions, including banks, including large businesses, zabaitsu is what they were called, occurred. The modernization of the military occurred. And if we have time to watch a part of The Last Samurai in class, I love to show this scene where the American military advisor comes and shows these Japanese soldiers who have never used a weapon before that had gunpowder, how to shoot a rifle or how to shoot a cannon. This was very, very different from the samurai way of fighting. And the samurai were not permitted to be in the military. It's not that they didn't want to be. Even if they wanted to be, they were not permitted to be. So they were taking civilians and training them in the military. They also provided universal education, and this would include education in technology and industry, and revamp their tax system so that it would be more profitable. So what were the effects of the Meiji Restoration? Huge economic costs on the backs of peasants. There's no question about that. Social upheaval. These class distinctions that had been around for generations upon generations upon generations are no longer there. The samurai and the daimyo and the shogun, who had been held in such high esteem for their skills, who practiced the Shinto religion in the way that they fought, no longer there. These were irrelevant. But one thing the Meiji Restoration really did do was lead to a rise of nationalism. So what Emperor Meiji really emphasized is we are Japanese. We may be taking on this technology that is not Japanese at its root, but we as people are Japanese. And this idea down the road is going to be a problem for China because Japan's going to invade China. And during World War II, you may not have learned about it much, but Japan was very much an aggressor in China in World War II. Japan also attacked the United States military at Pearl Harbor, and Korea. They also took control of Korea as well as Okinawa. So this nationalist idea would actually lead them to xenophobia or fear of the foreigner. But what they did do, which was unprecedented, was that in a single generation, Japan became a major industrial power. It even attained political and economic equality with Western Europe and the United States of America. This was a huge achievement. They proved themselves in the Russo-Japanese War, and we just talked about the fact that Russia was behind militarily, and this was definitely evident as Japan and Russia fought a naval battle that showed a decisive victory for the Japanese and their new military technology. So that is the end of chapter 19. This has been a very long chapter. We've talked a lot about a lot of things. And so remember, we started with the Ottomans, talked about the Russians, the Chinese, and now the Japanese. And something that I would encourage you to think about is their similarities and their differences. And I can say without a doubt, Japan was the most successful in industrializing and catching up with the West. Thanks for your attention. Goodbye.